And welcome back. We are finally at the point now where we can go ahead and make our sprite sheet. But before we do that, let's just take a quick moment to review a couple things here before we actually start moving some things over, and then I'll help you start setting up how to actually do this in Photoshop. So here, of course, we have our very first animation that we kind of looked at here with a animation, and we of course played that. You can remember it's simply a ball just moving up and down, up and down. And we of course have established that we know that each of these different pieces here is a different frame corresponding to different layers that we have within our animation. So if we keep that in mind, that each frame is each layer, another way to think about that is that each one of these frames is a snapshot of that sprite's movement. And if we think back to when we first introduced the idea of a sprite sheet, it was each one of those little cells within a sprite sheet is of course going to be very similar. So let's take a look at this animation as a sprite sheet. So you can see over here I've created a sprite sheet using that very same animation that we literally had over here. And you will see it's the ball bouncing at each different phases. So we have 8 frames here in our sprite sheet, which corresponds to our 8 frames of animation, which is also the same as our 8 layers that we have over here. Now, how do we go about setting this up? Now, of course, this is corresponding to one individual layer. We can, of course, do the same thing with layer groups. So each one of these frames here could be a layer group. So let's look at this setup, and I'm going to use the protocols that we just created here, and I'm going to do that with everything except for maybe the background, because maybe I don't want the background there, or I could keep the background in there as well. But let's just go ahead and set this up. How do you go about actually creating the spreadsheet so it's going to fit exactly, and you're not going to have things spilling over from one cell to another, or your size is going to be too big, too large? The first thing you have to think is, how big is the sprite? How big is the animation size? So if we look at our protocols, if you recall, if I go to image and image size, we had set this up as a 128 by 128 image, which is a pretty good size for us to work with. Now, of course, we can apply the same thing we're talking about here today to sprites of any size, whether it's 64 by 64, 32 by 32, 256 by 256, whatever size you have it set to, we can do the same thing. We saw this when we did the one exercise, the one lab where we had to figure out what size sprite sheet we would need for various things. So let's go ahead and do a little bit of math here. So let's just say if we have 12 frames here, that's a lot. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, let's just say I had only 8 frames. So the easiest way to figure this out is to grab your calculator and just say, okay, I have 128 pixels wide, 128, and I need a total of, let's say, 4 frames of animation. So that'd be times 4. And that would tell me then I need a total of 512 pixels in width to hold my sprite sheet. So that doesn't tell me the height though, because if I had 8, then I would have to take 128 times 2, which would be 256. And of course, that would then tell me I would need a 512 wide by a 256 height for this image. Now in my animation here, I have of course 12 frames of animation. So a 8 size wouldn't work, but I could do, for example, a 4 by 3. I could, of course, also do a 6 by 2, but a 4 by 3 would be a little bit easier for us to look at, a little more compact. So let's just do some quick math here. 128 times 4 gives me 512. And again, 128 times 3 is going to give me 384. All right, so keep those numbers in mind here. And yours might be a little different depending on how many frames you have in yours. In fact, when you do your lab today, you don't have to even do the protocols. You can pick a different animation that you want to work with. And I'm not going to walk through creating my full sprite sheet here today, but I'm going to show you how to get started. So I'm just going to close out of the image size here. And the first thing I'm going to do is go to File and New. And I'm going to go ahead and set my width and height. And remember, we said it was 512 pixels wide. And I said it was, I believe, 384 for our height. So 384. And of course, that will hold every sprite that I need in my sprite sheet to have all 12 frames of animation. I want to make sure this is transparent because we're not trying to have a background necessarily in our sprite sheet. There are maybe certain programs that might have a background color that you use to indicate transparency, but for our purposes here today, we're going to make sure that the background is transparent. And let's go ahead and create this image. And Control 0 just to zoom in. I don't need the timeline open right now, so I'm actually just going to go ahead and close that because we don't need it when we're making a sprite sheet. If I was making another animation, sure, it'd be very essential, but we're not doing that here right now. Now, if I were to go ahead and start bringing pieces over here, so let's just say I would take the background mask, hold down the shift key, grab, let's say frame 12, and I hit Control C to copy, come back here, Control V to paste, and I have this nice image in here. I'm going to turn on the frame animation for a second here. And if I were to go ahead and try and drag those around and put them in their proper place, one thing you will notice, of course, is that it's very hard to tell exactly where these images are supposed to start and where they're supposed to end. So let me just go ahead and just hide those just for a minute here. And the way we want to do this is by turning on grids within Photoshop. So we can come up here into our view menu and we can click on show, and you can see we have a couple different options here. All right, we have grid. If you turn that on, we'll just create a grid that we can use, and we can configure it that way. But I don't want to use that grid actually right now. We actually want to make sure that we are using something else. We're going to use guides here today. So I'm going to go down to view and then guides, and then I'm going to click on new guide layout. And what that's going to allow us to do is to create our own custom guide for how big things can be. So here, if you notice, we can do columns and rows. And you can just check those check boxes, and you can just predefine columns and rows that way. So for example, I have 4 columns and I say I want 3 rows. You will see that it automatically will divide it up into even amounts. And you can choose your color here. It might be like cyan, or you might have like red, and it doesn't matter what color. That's just a visual color for you to choose from, of where you can say, where is the edge of this image? And of course, I always leave the preview here checked just because it lets me, at a quick visual glance, know, are my guides exactly where I need them to be? Now, conversely, if we don't want to do numbers, we can, of course, do width. So, for example, if I say 128, I'm going to take the numbers out here for a second and say 128. You notice that when I do that, you notice we don't get those pixels in here. Or we don't have the guidelines show up. And so, even though we can give it a width and height, that allows us to have more finite control over the width of the columns and rows themselves. So we still have to define the number of columns and number of rows. And because our sprites are all square, I'm not going to worry about defining width and height. Now this can be something if, for example, we had a different width and height. So let's just say I had 128 wide, but let's say my height was only, let's say 100 pixels. And you will see that at 100 pixels now, you can see how those are different. So this is where it comes really handy when I have sprites that I might need to have a different size for. But I might still have a 4x3, but I can of course go ahead and set this up. But if we did our math correctly, then we won't have to necessarily worry about plugging in width and height, but it's just something I want to show you in here that you can do. Gutter, of course, is something that if you add in here, we'll of course add in areas between each sprite. So if you wanted kind of a boundary between each sprite box, you can do that. But again, because of how we did our math and how we're setting things up today, we are not going to worry about gutter. So if you have any values in your gutter, just go ahead and delete them. Same thing with margin. You can just clear all that out. So we're just going to do row and columns here. So 4x3 in my example. And now that I have this created, if I turn back on that sprite, I can then just go ahead and drag that to where I want to go. Now there is one thing you do want to make sure that you have set on. If I go back into view, you will see there's this snap option on. Make sure snap is on, and make sure you have snap to guides checked. If that is not checked, it means that when you go ahead and drag your image, it's not going to go ahead and try to put it right in here to this nice bounding box. It's going to try to put it where it thinks is best. And so now you can see I can drag in there. You see how we have these nice kind of highlight lines showing up. Those purple lines there to indicate that's Photoshop snapping my image to where it's supposed to go. And so if I go ahead and now go back to my portfolio, and I'm going to go ahead and click on the background again, holding down the control key this time, grabbing frame 11, I'm going to copy that one. If I go back over here and paste that in, you will of course now have the background mask in frame 11. And so now I can go ahead and move those into where they're supposed to be. Now, one thing you will notice, I put 12 up here, so I can actually just make sure I grab both of those there for frame 12 and the background mask. And I go ahead and grab those, and I can move those down to the proper place. So here's frame 12, frame 11. Great. Now, one thing you will notice that as I'm doing this is that if you have anything in your image that before was masked but just kind of existed outside that box, and this is a great way to note this, is that you notice here we have that portfolio existing outside. And this is where we can bring in something such as our crop tool here to go ahead and use that to pretty much remove those areas outside. And that, you notice with the crop tool, it also uses the snapping feature. And once it's cropped to that zone, it will create this kind of bounding box around the sprite, and anything outside that box for that crop, it's going to delete. So I'm just going to hit check, and you notice it got rid of everything, and that's not quite what we want. So it is something to kind of keep in mind here, is that when we're cropping this, we got to make sure that we are cropping on just those layers that we want to crop with. Otherwise, we could end up actually taking out pieces that we don't want to. Now, of course, we could use other tools that we have at our disposal, such as the eraser tool. So I could just go ahead here, take my eraser, for example. So, you know what? I don't want that gate to be all the way up there. I'm just going to erase that. Boom. Go to this frame here. Go to my gate. Boom. Erase that off. Because, again, we're not worried about what happens beyond here, because this is just a sprite sheet. We're just using this from our animation to set up. And of course, I can bring in the rest of those sprites as I want to, bring them in. So for example, let's do one more. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab the background mask. Let's go ahead and grab frame 10. And I could even copy this where I could grab like frame 9 and 8, for example. So let's just copy those. Go back over here and paste those in. And one thing you will note is that when I do that, though, is that when I was doing this, you notice how I had background mask in each of these? If I grab the background mask and let's say frame 10, and I go ahead and say, you know, I want to move those into position, you'll notice that when I copy that over, it did not bring over that background layer there. So I will have to be careful to make sure that I copy that background mask in between each of those other layers that I want. Either that or add that background mask into each of these individual frames, so that way it exists in such a manner that it's never going to be hidden where it can't actually benefit us in the long run. So now that everything's in position, if we go ahead and keep moving here, so we already moved frame 10, so let's say background mask in frame 9, for example. I'm going to go ahead and make sure I actually click those. There we go. And now we can move those. Looks like it's not quite grabbing here. So sometimes it can be a little fickle when you're trying to move to certain objects around, especially if certain objects are grouped here in multiple locations. But again, you can play around with this to kind of get to see where different objects are going around. So here I am grabbing this, and you notice I got a huge selection of different layers here. And that's because I brought all those layers over at once. And that can be a disadvantage sometimes. So I'm just going to delete these out of here when you are bringing over multiple objects. So again, something just to kind of keep in mind here as you are working through some of these. And apparently I removed one too many of my masks, but that's okay. So let's delete this frame 8 out, and I'm going to delete frame 9. And go back to my selection tool. Looks like I have a couple gateways just floating out here, so I can go ahead and just delete those out as well. So there is a caution. Again, I show that mostly just because I want you to take a caution when you start working with some of these different layers and how they can affect different things here, because they do play an important role into how we ultimately create our sprite sheet here. Now, I'm going to go ahead and let you go and see what you can do with creating your very own sprite sheet. So you can pick any animation that we've done up to this point, and it can be, you know, the gateway that we've done here. It could be a different one that we have. It could be, you know, any really animation that we've done. Go ahead and create a sprite sheet for it. You'll have to do maybe just a little bit of math to customize it to create the sprite sheet you want. But I'm going to go ahead and pause the video, come back, I'll show you my complete sprite sheet of my protocols, and then let's go ahead and compare and see how you did on your sprite sheet. And here we have it. This is my complete sprite sheet of my protocols with its 12 frames of animation. Again, you can go ahead and create your own sprite sheet with any of the animations that we've done up to this point. It doesn't have to be the protocols, but again, it should have exactly the number of frames you have. If you have a sprite sheet that has, for example, an empty frame here, then you might need to go back and think, how can I rearrange this so that way I don't have an empty frame? So for example, if you had 10 frames of animation and you did a 4x3 grid, you have 2 empty cells here. If you have like one, that's not as big of a deal, but if you have 2 empty cells here, there might be a different way for you to arrange this. So for example, 10 you might do 5x2. So think about those as you go ahead and we start moving forward. And next time, let's go ahead and take all these techniques that we've done and start applying it towards creating additional sprites and animations.